this Europeanization of the political space is not happening. I would rather say we are witnessing a de-Europeanization of the political conversation. We're going back to our national capitals discussions. We're going back to the power dynamics existing at the national level. And this gives us a pretty mixed bag, meaning that it is very difficult today to second guess what kind of result we might expect, how the next European Parliament is going to look like, simply because each European country is telling a different story.
Welcome to the ELIAMEP podcast series. I have the pleasure to host in this podcast Professor Alberto Alemanno, Professor in European Union Law, to discuss the upcoming elections in the European Parliament, the challenges that Europe faces, and also the danger that comes from the new far-right normal. Thank you, Professor, for finding the time for this discussion. And I want to start our podcast by asking you, you have talked about creating authentic democracy within the European Union. Can you elaborate on that? And aren't the European Parliament elections the most pure form of democracy, or are they not enough?
Let me start by saying that historically, citizens have played a very minimal role in European integration. Their voice has been pretty much marginalized. It is the member states, their countries of origin, that have been defining the European integration process. And the word democracy appeared in the European treaties only 60, 70 years after the EU integration started. Having said so, I belong to those who argued that Europe does not necessarily suffer from a democratic deficit because citizens are not as involved as they are at the national level. I think what Europe suffers from is more an intelligibility deficit, meaning understanding who takes decision and who is accountable for those decisions in relation to citizens. You're certainly right in pointing to the fact that since 1979, at least, European citizens have the chance to elect directly their representatives who sit in Strasbourg in the European Parliament. However, when you look at how these European elections are organized, every 5 years, they tend to take place on different dates. We have the Belgian and the Netherlands, Dutch voting on Thursday and Friday, and with many countries voting on Saturday, others on Sunday. But not only the European elections take place on different days, they also see basically national parties competing for their votes, running national programs and presenting national candidates. So much for European politics, right? There's very little European in the way in which European elections are organized. There are basically 27 parallel national elections whose outcome will then define future members of the European Parliament who, once elected, they will come together into what we call European political parties, which are very loose federations of parties, which are not even ideologically homogeneous, invisible to the average voter. So we clearly have an issue in Europe because we don't have really a European political party system. We don't have a pan-European political competition, and we don't have a pan-European media sphere that allow us to understand through the European as opposed to the national perspective what is actually happening in Europe. The good news is that European democracy decided to be not only acknowledged in the treaties, at least since 2001 and then 2009 with the Lisbon Treaty, but also the fact that our European democratic institutions do not only derive their legitimacy from representation, so the MEPs that I mentioned and directly by their government, but also through participation. So it is possibly the only jurisdiction in the world, the European Union, that clearly says our democratic legitimacy does not only come from electoral democracy, but it also comes from participation. And that's why the EU over time has created a lot of channels of participation, which on paper allow anyone to file a petition to the parliament, to register a European citizen initiatives, to participate to a public consultation or to lodge a complaint. And when you look at these channels of participation open to over 450 million citizens in Europe, those are certainly in a larger number than they exist at the national level. So I challenge any European member state to offer as many opportunities. However, when you look at the realities of participation, there is again a bit of a dark side because most of the channels of participation tend to be little known due to the limited literacy about democratic channels in Europe, but they're also very little used. So at the end of the day, the fact that Europe has such a strong and shared democratic legitimacy, both on the one hand, political representatives, and the other hand, the participatory mechanism, this is not really making enough of a difference. And at some point, I think Europe will have to tackle its own democratic crisis. We have been discussing about its financial crisis, its own public health situation as a result of the COVID crisis, the financial crisis that followed the COVID pandemic. We managed to overcome all of these crises because, first of all, we did acknowledge the existence of those crises, whereas when it comes to the democratic crisis of the European Union, there's not political will to fully recognize it. And that's basically where we are, just facing a moment of truth with Europe set to decide whether or not to enlarge itself, meaning to widen its borders. And in order to do that, we will certainly also need to deepen, meaning to review the internal institutional procedures that allow us to decide and to remain agile and effective. So 2023, 2024 in particular will be a particular dividing line between the Europe as we know it and the Europe that has to emerge as a result of these both internal and external challenges to European democracy.
Well, are you worried about the outcome of the elections? And I am asking that because sometimes I have the feeling that for the European citizens, democracy is like it is out of date in some ways. We see how they vote in national elections. And so are you worried? Are you worried that we will see what happened in Slovakia or what is happening in Hungary, that we will see it also in the European elections?
Well, there's no doubt that democracies as we know them have been losing grounds in terms of limited responsiveness to the demand of citizens. This is not necessarily a European phenomenon. It's something that we see happening all across the world, including inside of the EU, but which is making it particularly difficult for the European Union as the only supranational democracy, a democracy that exists beyond borders and that requires some specific legitimacy that has to come from the bottom up. So am I concerned? Partly I'm concerned to the extent that I see 2024 elections as a step back compared to 2019 or 2014, when the overall conversation at the time was to Europeanize the political competition, meaning giving greater visibility to European political parties and allowing the average citizen to basically see which European political family could represent her the most. Were there the liberals, the socialists, the conservatives? And the idea was to give full visibility to the fact that her choice as a voter would have affected many other millions of people living across borders, and that would have been a pan-European decision. In 2024, this Europeanization of the political space is not happening. I would rather say we are witnessing a de-Europeanization of the political conversation. We're going back to our national capitals discussions. We're going back to the power dynamics existing at the national level. And this gives us a pretty mixed bag, meaning that it is very difficult today to second guess what kind of result we might expect, how the next European Parliament is going to look like, simply because each European country is telling a different story. Take the case of Spain. Snap elections show how the far right, represented by Vox, was defied. It was a major defeat for that party, being xenophobic, being extremely populist, slightly anti-European, whereas the Slovakian story that we have seen after a few months shows us the opposite. It is possible for populist forces, even those that have been governing in the past, in that case, not the far right, rather a leftist party, but with very populistic tone, which are even pro-Russian in this particular historical moment, they still manage to get and to capture the imagination of the electorate. What do we make out of these diverging trends? Will the next European Parliament will have, for the first time in history, a right-wing majority? I don't think so. I think it is more reasonable to imagine a European Parliament that will still see a majority emerging from mainstream party, most likely a more center-right balance of power than the current one, the 2019-2024, which was a more center-left European Parliament. But these parties will have less seats, will have less members, and therefore their own majority will be limited. We can expect all mainstream party, from the European Popular Party to the Liberals to the Socialists, to shrink in size, to need some support from the Greens, perhaps the left. The Greens are going to be the major losers because they are in government in Germany and they are not able to deliver on their promises. And the Conservatives, meaning the ECR, the party led by Giorgia Meloni, currently president of the Council, what we call Prime Minister in Italy, but certainly leading that political family, together with Poland and with the governing party, PIS, which future will also be defined in a matter of days in the national elections. So as you can see, a lot of uncertainty, but most likely we're going to see continuity, but an erosion of the fundamental balance that was struck over time between the two major political families, meaning the Popular Party and the Socialists, and the need for these two parties to rely not only on the centrists, but also a bit on the left, a bit on the right of the political spectrum in order to be able to vote for the next commission. Where I have more concern is rather the nature of the next College of Commissioners. That under European institutional framework, we need a strong European Commission that is the only institution that can propose legislation, that is actually leading the way in defining what kind of policies Europeans need. And that College of Commissioners might, for the first time, have members who are appointed, as it is written in the treaty, by their national governments, but being extremely dependent and therefore impartial. And therefore unimpartial from their capitals. I'm particularly concerned about this situation we might be seeing in Hungary, but potentially also in other governments, where for the first time the national commissioners might be acting as national politicians as opposed to European politicians tasked to identify the general European interest as opposed to the national interest. I think that could be a strong risk, having a weak European Commission, partly paralyzed, followed by a parliament that might have a very shrinking majority. This might lead to paralysis. This might lead to a delay in delivering of the many promises we're going to be hearing during the electoral campaign to the citizens. And this might damage the sustainability and resilience of the European integration process. So this de-Europeanization I was alluding to might actually come with a very high price tag, that of paralysis, delay, and decredibilization of the entire European integration process in the eyes of the citizens of Europe and its residents.
Why do you think that the European Union as a whole and the national governments, even the very much pro-European governments, have lost this game, have lost the game of convincing the people, of showing the European people that the best thing that could have happened to them is being a member of the EU? I see that happening also in Greece, where wherever you look, you see that everything has been done, has been built, has been made, also with the help of the European Union, of EU funds. Every good thing that we have, not every, but many good things that we have in our laws comes from the European Union. And it's difficult to tell them that, look, why are you not so much pro-European Union? What do you think has played a role in that? What was wrong?
There's certainly a paradox when you look at how the European Union is perceived as opposed to how much it has delivered. If you think about the most recent events of the last decade or so, from the sovereign debt crisis to Brexit, to the terrorist attacks, to COVID, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all these have been testing the European ability to respond to new transnational challenges. And none of these challenges could have been solved by the members of the union alone. And these governments didn't shy away from taking bold decisions in emergency situations, oftentimes acting ultra vires, acting beyond the competencies that the European Union itself possesses, in order to somehow collectivize those crises and to, for instance, pool the funds for COVID-affected members, Next Generation EU, the idea of repaying this with European-wide taxes, having joint procurement for vaccines and now for weapons, setting up an emergency system to welcome war refugees. All of this prove that the EU is not only resilient, but is also relevant. So all of a sudden, I would say citizens of Europe, and we can see this in the Eurobarometer, look at Europe as a problem solver as opposed to a trouble maker. And this is a major change in perception. And that's possibly why in 2019 we witnessed such an increase in the turnout in the European elections. More people than ever show up. More than half of the people were actually entitled to, 51% plus. However, these responses taken in an emergency, a bit cutting the corner of the institutional framework, also unveil the limits of the European institutional structure and purpose today. More and more citizens seem confused about what the union could do or should do, and mainly, and this is my direct response to your question, because in Europe we only have national politicians, meaning we don't have real, genuine politicians. Everybody who is somehow calling the shots in Brussels needs a democratic legitimation at the national level. That's where voters are called upon to cast their ballot. That basically means that no European leader, not even the most visible, being Mr. Macron or Scholz in this particular moment, is accountable beyond their border. In other words, what are the incentives for European leaders to actually take responsibility for situations that take place outside of their national constituencies? Very little. And this might explain why it is much easier, even for the most pro-European political leaders, to bash the European Union, to blame the European institution as if they were a third party, a third actor, in which they had no say whatsoever. It's very easy to talk about Brussels. It's very easy to talk about the EU as if our own political leaders had not a seat in it. And this game, which is a game that reveals irresistible for all political leaders and politicians, seem to be still happening after so many decades. At the end of the day, what are the incentives for these politicians to tell their voters that the most important decisions affecting their lives are taken at the EU level, and they are no longer taken in the national capital where they sit and where they pretend to actually run their countries, which are already jointly run with other European political reasons? Apologies for caricaturalizing a little bit, but I think this is the issue, an issue, again, of intelligibility, readability, understanding of what the European integration is, what kind of decision is taking for the citizens, and why it's important to become much more transparent and accountable in telling them and making them fully aware of the fact that basically national sovereignty is already a shared reality in which other politicians are actually indirectly taking decisions on behalf of other people without ever being politically accountable. This mismatch is really the root cause that is holding us back from making progress. It is delaying our ability to decide. And again, this is what is at stake today. As we are considering to enlarge the European Union, we certainly need to put our house in order.
Professor Alemanno, thank you very much for this discussion, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to talk again as we come more nearer the election, and of course to analyze the results. I hope that they will surprise us in a good way. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I share the same hope. Thank you for having me.
This was another EliaMep podcast with Odin Linardatou. Recording, editing and sound editing by Petros Karpathiou. Follow us on the EliaMep channels on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts and elsewhere.